Purnima.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Glenda, for this nice introduction. Sorry, I was just trying to work my system while speaking. So just give me a moment. I'll try and
It's
get
okay. I've
the
had all
session.
sorts of problems today I never anticipated.
Yeah, I'm just trying to
It's a
choose the
strange environment.
window. So yeah. Um,
And thank you, Chantal, for all the sorting out.
No problem. Doing my best. So have you got your PowerPoint presentation open, Purnima?
yes, I do.
Okay.
I am not able to find the screen. That's the only problem.
Okay. Like to choose the screen that you want to share.
I think I've got it now,
Let's try.
or I've got the wrong one up. No, that's the wrong one.
Oh,
No,
it's the
that's
wrong one. Okay.
one. Yeah, sorry.
It's
Okay.
there now, Purnima?
I think this is she was saying this is the wrong presentation.
Oh, that's the wrong
That's
presentation.
the wrong one. Yeah,
Looks good though, but anyway, go ahead.
yeah, that's the work in progress one. So hopefully the right one will open up now.
Yep, we can see something with some light bulbs.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's the right one.
Okay.
Have I stopped sharing?
No, you're still sharing, but if you could go to full screen for the PowerPoint or like slideshow.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Just bear with me, please. Is that all right now?
That's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research. And it's been such a great seminar so far, and I've learned so much from everyone. So it's great to be here. I just want to apologize for my background. You might see a Peppa Pig floating. That's just my 14-year-old's toys around. I haven't been able to tidy up. 14-month-old, sorry. So yes, apologize if it's distracting in the background. So I just want to give a little background about my research. Sorry. So this is a particular paper that I started working on a year ago. So this is a systematic literature review on emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, and diverse leadership. And since then, a lot of progress has been made on this topic, but I wanted to talk about this particular paper for one main reason is that it talks about the main literature on this subject matter that is available, and it draws also on the key areas of concern and the key research gaps which I felt would be very relevant for the workshop and for the seminar today. So this is a paper that was written almost about 9 to 10 months ago. So this is a systematic literature review on the three basic constructs that we were examining, that is EI, CI, and diverse leadership. But before I get into explaining what the literature found and what we looked at, certain key data points that came up during that process, which kind of became the cornerstone of why this research was important and why are we even talking about diverse leadership. So particularly for Australia, the data on the Australian Human Rights Commission as of 2018 said that Australians of European background continue to dominate the Australian CEOs as much as by 97%, despite Australia being a very multicultural and a very mixed culture and a mixed race and ethnicity that we see at the workplace. The data also said that more than 95% of senior leaders were from an Anglo-Celtic or European background. Despite the fact that 24% of Australian population was made up of non-European and indigenous backgrounds, they accounted for only 5% of senior leaders, and I'm talking only about corporates and global organizations here. And lastly, it said that although 10% of the Australian community as of 2015 were of Asian background, there was only about 1.9% of executive managers and only 4% directors who came from the Asian cultural origins. This was just Australia, and two main points that were being talked about at that point in time around the world. One was that 5 out of Fortune 500 companies have only African American CEOs, and only one leader who openly identifies as gay. And another very important point of view that was brought up by the New York Times was that the number of men who are the CEOs or leadership positions with, names of John, Robert, William, or James, which is classically, the Western male population that governs the leadership space, there were only about one woman as of four men named of this common type, which kind of brought out the inconsistency and the imbalance in the leadership positions, not just in Australia, but around the world, which brought our attention to why it is so important to talk about diverse leaders and people from all different backgrounds and not just the typical white man, male profile that leadership holds as of today. So the three main constructs that I will be talking about, and let me introduce them to you one by one. The first one is emotional intelligence, which is measured by EQ. And the definition that we look at is as an ability to watch not just one's own, but others' feelings and emotions, to be able to discriminate among them and to guide their actions and their thinking and their feeling as of that. Cultural intelligence, which is measured as CQ, is also a capability to identify, analyze, and respond to situations which are characterized by cultural diversity. And for my particular study, we looked at diversity or diverse leaders as organizational leaders. For example, the C-suite leaders, senior managers, line managers, business heads, who identify themselves as either surface level or deep level diverse. So surface level diversity is diversity which can be seen by the eye. So it could be color, sex, height, it could even be physical disability. But deep level diversity is people who think differently. It could be sexual orientation, it could be value systems, it could be attitudes. So we looked at and we kept that open at that stage, that anyone who identifies himself as diverse from any of these point of views would be considered a diverse organizational leader. I'm just checking in that I am audible and the slides are visible.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. So a quick introduction on what this entire landscape is about. So leadership, as we all know, is very central to success of organizations. And diverse leaders, they have a double-edged sword responsibility, because not only do they need to manage and motivate a global workforce, a diverse workforce, but they also have to manage their own identity, which could be and which is most of the time different from the team that they are leading. 90% of leadership success, as of the literature, it depends on the leader's EI. But the questions are being raised today is that, is EI really sufficient? Is it enough to be an effective leader? Or does there need to be more than that? Have we considered cultural intelligence and what role does that play? Workforces are becoming more and more diverse. And I think with COVID, it's going to get more and more diverse, more and more different, with different patterns and different things coming into play. So why are we still looking at a leader as someone who's white, who's male, and who's around 45 years of age? Why is there so much of diversity fatigue in the leadership profile? I mean, there is a lot being talked about on diversity, on leadership, on inclusivity, but then still when we go down to brass tacks, there is a fatigue of diversity in the leadership profile. Diverse leaders, they tend to fight cultural stereotypes and glass ceilings, which their other male white counterparts will not have to face. So what are we doing as organizations to support that? And diverse leaders are still evaluated against traditional accepted leadership attributes, which could be contradictory, which could be different from their ethnic or social backgrounds. And this is something which is really interesting because it has been spoken about in the earlier presentations as well, that we are looking at a very Western understanding of leadership, a very Western archaic understanding of leadership, and measuring everything up against that as a benchmark. So what are three things that this paper looked at? One, it wanted to examine the relationship between EI, CI, and diverse leadership. I wanted to identify key research gaps in the literature and what could be certain future areas that needs to be focused on in this subject matter. So The methodology that was adopted to do this was a systematic literature review. So this is a very brief process of how the systematic literature review works out. So the first step is, I've just put this in to, given some idea as to how we arrived at the data that I'll be talking about today. So the first step is to determine the inclusion criteria. So what about EI, CI, and diverse leadership will we be studying from the whole universe of information available? Second, identifying key relevant keywords and abstracts, articles, journals, databases, which will be looked at for culling out this information. Collecting the data, categorizing, subcategorizing based on research objectives and coming up with patterns. And finally, analyzing the data and reporting the findings. So why did we choose a systematic literature review? One of the things that was found during the process was that this is quite a nascent topic, especially cultural intelligence and diverse leadership, and not much has been historically talked about or researched in this area. So the idea was to come up with a set of information, a set of literature that can be reproduced easily, which can be assessed for future use as well. We wanted to remove any kind of potential bias, any kind of stereotyping of the literature itself. The systematic literature review process helps identify key gaps and potential research areas from the pattern finding, which is very important for this particular paper. And also it helps to make this body of research available to other researchers who can add on, who can share knowledge and exchange knowledge in the subject matter. What were the findings? So from the entire systematic literature review process, we came up with 51 articles from over around 1,200 articles that were initially screened, which kind of fit what we were trying to arrive at with this paper. And the key highlights were that the journals that were focusing on this research area were mostly from US and Europe. Some of those third world countries have been mentioned in the research, but there really was no journal or researcher from those part of the world who were talking about live experiences there. Also, it was found that available from 2016 onwards. There was a spike in 2011, but otherwise there's not been too many articles found. It's been more towards the recent years that a lot has been talked about in this subject matter. What were the findings between the relationship between EI and diverse leadership? So 50% of the studies reported that there's a significant positive relationship between EI and leadership, especially transformational leadership, which talks about empowering, which talks about giving the followers a good feeling and a good sense of empowerment and encouragement in what they do. But there was a significant research gap on empirical studies done between the relationship between EI and diverse leadership. There really was no definite reason as to why not much has been explored in this area, but definitely there is a gap where empirical examination has been done on diversity outcomes. Similarly, when we looked at CI and diverse leadership, it was found that CI studies still focused a lot on expatriates, on cultural adaptation, on people traveling overseas or students traveling overseas and fitting into a different culture. But there really was not any direct studies done between the relationship between CI and diverse leadership, other than people who traveled overseas and expatriates. So that was, again, a potential research gap that came through. What was also found out was that there really is no holistic approach looking at intelligences and diverse leadership together. There really was nothing which talked about EI, CI, and culturally diverse leaders talking and their relationship all together. Out of 51 papers studied, only 9 examined the relationship between EI and CI and leadership, while there were only 3 which briefly talked about culturally diverse leadership. What does this tell us? It really tells us that researchers are studying these constructs and this subject matter is being looked at, but it's being looked at very independently and in pockets. Amalgamation is required to look at a holistic picture. What was important and what was encouraging was that 60% of the studies showed a positive relationship between EI/CI and leadership. And all the three papers that talked about EI/CI and culturally diverse leadership showed that they all kind of positively work together, and they kind of complement each other. What is the implication of the study? Where does this take us? What does this tell us? It has already been proved in the literature that emotional intelligence is the glue that helps leaders work together. It is really, really important for an organization from a performance point of view, from a job satisfaction point of view, from a productivity point of view, to have leaders who show EI, who are able to speak the EI and demonstrate the EI way of work. The Center for Creative Leadership argues that most reasons why leadership fails is because there's a lack of EI and EI competencies. It's also important for us to realize that there is really no evidence why this relationship has not been explored more empirically, and definitely it is like sitting on the shelf waiting to be discovered. It is also very important to realize that employees who have high EI are in a better position to demonstrate cultural intelligence behaviors as well. So there is a lot that is happening between the intelligences, and that needs to be discovered and looked at more deeply. CI is required with EI, especially when you're traveling overseas, when there's cross-cultural intelligence concerned, because emotions is something that governs people, whether it's in the business world, whether it's in our personal life. So really cannot separate being emotionally intelligent while looking at cultural intelligence. Training, development, leadership behavior, they're all significantly impacted by cultural intelligence. It is not a one-off situation when someone is traveling anymore. Within the same office place, within the same team, there are people from different cultures, different belief systems. So these elements, they do talk to each other and they need to be considered. It is also important to realize that studying and measuring CI in isolation of EI, or EI in isolation of CI, which has been done historically, is kind of ineffective, because these intelligences, they talk to each other and they kind of give us the whole picture when studied together, because they do influence and they do impact each other. So specifically talking about diverse leadership as a profile of leaders, the diverse leader's responsibility is not just to manage organizational diversity, but to lead the way for personal diversity as well. So he needs, or she needs, all the help and all the backing up from an organization's perspective. Conflicts and communication gaps that occur in organizations which are globally diverse is usually due to a lack of cultural and emotional intelligence, which is why it is important to put that back into the system. Diverse leaders as a profile is very minutely studied. It has not been looked at considerably at all, other than, of course, the Globe study, which talked about different cultures and how people behave in these different cultures, including leaders. But leaders as diverse leaders, as a profile, needs to be studied. What are their traits? What are their characteristics? What are their challenges? How do they behave? Why do they behave the way they do? To understand how to make it more effective. So based on the various findings and the implications of these findings, we looked at proposing a few future areas of research. First, and most importantly, it's important to include studies from developing and underdeveloped nations. We need to hear that voice, because a lot of these diverse leaders are from those nations. So it's important to understand the story from that side of the world. Empirical studies on diversity intelligence needs to be looked at, and how does diversity intelligence plays out with emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. A holistic model studying the intelligences together, because they kind of work with each other. The profile of diverse leaders as such needs to be looked at. The characteristics, features need to be drawn out. Also, it'll be quite incomplete if we don't talk about artificial intelligence, because that is where the world is headed, especially the future of work. So what is the role of EI and CI in managing artificial intelligence or artificially emotional AEI systems in organizations? And that could also be a potential stem off from a research area. So just to conclude, yes, EI and CI have a positive relationship with organizational leadership. There is not much debate on that. Yes, EI has had a lot of criticism in terms of it being a manipulative behavior, or it could have dark tendencies. But it has been argued that EI significantly contributes to a good team environment and cannot be denied that leaders need to show EI. There is a research gap in relation to the role that EI and CI plays on cultural diverse leaders, and empirical research needs to be done to fill out that gap. Cultural intelligence needs to extend from expatriation and needs to extend from traveling overseas to looking at it from a more broader and inward perspective. And how is a culturally diverse leader different? And what are the skills and what are the intelligence abilities that he or she shows needs to be looked at more deeply. Thank you so much. That was the initial starting point of my research. And I guess as I move on, I will discover more and add more to this gamut that I'm talking about. So thank you so much for listening in. And any questions, please feel free to ask me.
Thank you, Nina.